Debates can make or break a campaign. We've seen historic zingers from guys like Reagan that have turned the tide of an election. But the question is, have you ever seen anything like Donald Trump, let alone what we saw last night? Well, let's bring in our guest, Dr. Yannick Miskowski. He's professor of history at Dowling College. He's also a presidential historian as well. Yannick, first of all, we already know some of the numbers that came in. In terms of presidential primaries and debates, it was far and away the most watched debate last night ever. And there was, I think, some reality TV appeal to it, train wreck TV, whatever you want to call it. But did it remind you of any other debate you'd ever seen? The format, the 10 guys on the stage, the guy in the middle that nobody saw coming a few months ago? Did it in any way connect to anything you'd seen prior?
Well, we've had some crowded Republican fields in the past. Last time around in 2012, there was a fairly crowded field, at least one returnee, Governor Perry of Texas. But one historical parallel that I think of is the 1980 Republican primary field, where you had a bunch of luminaries. You had Ronald Reagan, you had somebody who eventually ended up challenging both Reagan and Carter as a third-party candidate, Representative John B. Anderson of Illinois. You had Howard Baker, a very well-known senator from Tennessee, John Connally, and Philip Crane, a representative of Illinois, representing the far right wing of the Republican Party. So this crowded GOP field reminds me quite a bit of the 1980 primaries.
I don't remember a Trump, though. There have been some obscure candidates, but never front runners. And I know we're still only in August, more than a year and change away from the general. That said, though, Yannick, I mean, what do you historically put him in? What kind of context? Is there any parallel? Perot, but Perot was about substance. He might have been quirky, but he had his own platforms going. Do you have to almost go back to the know-nothing party? I mean, where does Trump fit in historically, especially since he was 10 points clear of the field, if you believe the polls as of yesterday going into it?
Yeah, well, historically, 20%, a little over 20%, which is what Trump is drawing, isn't a lot. It's certainly not enough to win an election. So it seems like he's the front runner right now, but in terms of the numbers, that's not a lot of weight. But you hit a very good example of a historical parallel, Ross Perot, where in 1992 he really seemed to answer this populist tone of fear about the deficit, which he addressed with those infomercials where he used charts and a pointer. Another parallel I could draw is 1968 with George Wallace, where he criticized the pointy-headed intellectuals and liberals and long-haired people who didn't know how to work and weren't working. And he really touched a nerve, as Donald Trump seems to be touching a nerve right now. And George Wallace went on, like Ross Perot did, to run a third-party candidacy and attracted almost a little over 13% of the vote as a third-party candidate.
You know, Yannick, we've had around this table all week, whether it be former elected officials, consultants, and they say there's a danger here in the Trump campaign, not just about now, here and now. I think the consensus is he's probably not going to make it when it's all said and done. However, that this tapping into anger and this celebration of the ugly part of this, is that a little bit Pollyannish? Have we seen these guys before where they try and get the ugliest elements out there and try and play free and easy, whether it's anti-immigrant or, you know, you can argue anti-women, some of the stuff that comes out of his mouth? Is he really that new?
Well, one of the dangers is that it does seem to bring out the ugliness of some people's emotions. It also tends to focus a disproportionate amount of attention on celebritydom. I mean, Donald Trump is the star of The Apprentice, a real estate mogul, and the media's attention seems to be converging almost entirely on him. And people use the metaphor of sucking all the oxygen out of the room. And I think that's happening with Donald Trump, often at the expense of substantive issues.
Mm-hmm. Finally, Yannick, for folks who looked at last night and, you know, or they're claiming, my gosh, we're going off a cliff in terms of, does time seem to sort these things out historically? That, again, we're more than a year from the general. People aren't going to be voting for 6 months. That people say, you know what, in time people will either be exposed, the temperature will come down, substance will rise up a little bit. I know it's theater, I know it's politics, but with the benefit of time, sanity does prevail? Is that more often than not the rule?
I think so, if you look at past history. Well, part of debates is the theatrics of television, and the camera doesn't lie, and eventually sometimes warts of candidates do get exposed, whether it be, for example, Richard Nixon's shiftiness in the 1960
The flop
debate.
sweat, yep.
Yeah, the sweatiness and shifty-eyed character of Richard Nixon. But if you look at, for example, in past primaries, Rudy Giuliani in 2008 was leading the pack, and it seemed like he was preordained to be the nominee. That didn't work out at all. And then in 2012, it seemed like every month or so, a different person would rise to the top and then meet a comeuppance until finally Mitt Romney became the nominee. So things do tend to sort themselves out after time, after the flavor of the month sort of gets retired each month.
Well, we certainly have more time, and you're going to be hearing a lot more, obviously, about not just Mr. Trump here, but the whole field. And obviously, we'll be hearing from the Democrats in time as well. Yannick, as always, I appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Rich.
All right, coming up next, everyone, speaking of history, 50 years after the signing of the Voting Rights Act, there is a push to roll back some of its gains. We're going to talk to an NAACP official who's fighting the fight to make sure everyone who wants to vote can vote.